In today's video, we have some unbelievably bizarre statements that Jordan Peterson makes about the lion diet. You're not going to want to miss this. Roll the titles.
For the record, I'm done trying to make y'all comfortable. For the record, you ain't trying to grow, then it's done for you.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. As always, just a quick reminder that I'm now offering the SIBO organic acid stool test and consult via my website. So if you have any health or digestive problems, then consider taking these tests, as they will provide a lot of very detailed information upon which you can start making informed decisions and then start getting your health back on track. And on that bombshell, to the video.
Well, I've only been eating beef fundamentally, for almost 5 years now. I never imagined in my wildest dreams, number one, that you could just live on meat, and number two, that it would have such a salutary effect.
You wouldn't think that people could smoke, drink heavily or take drugs for years on end and survive. The human body is a fairly robust machine and it will do what it can to protect you. So I don't really understand Jordan's point here. Just because he is doing okay now, it doesn't mean that there will be no repercussions to the way he eats at some point in the future.
So for me, I lost 52 pounds in 7 months. I went from 212 pounds to 165, which is exactly what I weighed when I was 23. And I've maintained that weight since. I can put on muscle mass with no problem, even though I'm 62.
So these are very superficial statements he is making here. Health is about far more than just being in an acceptable weight or being able to put on muscle. How often do we see in society people with normal weights drop down from cardiac arrests? If you base your health solely on putting on weight or putting on muscle, then you will likely be setting yourself up for failure over the longer term.
I had a host of inflammatory conditions, some of which were quite serious, including peripheral uveitis, which sometimes blinds people, in my right eye, and it disappeared completely, along with psoriasis and gastric reflux disorder, and interestingly enough, gum disease, which is technically incurable, which is linked to cardiovascular degeneration, and which has gone away 100% in my case, according to multiple measures that my dentists have taken.
Again, I don't fully understand the points he is trying to make here. No doubt he will try and say, I ate certain foods and they caused him to have certain health problems, and that must mean that these foods are bad and somehow toxic to humans. There are 7.8 billion people on this planet, and the vast majority of these people have no issues eating fruits and vegetables unless the basis of these diets is junk foods. I would love to know what specialist he visited or what extensive testing he did to identify underlying gut problems. It's funny how he never mentions any of this.
And so when I've talked to many people who've lost like 100 pounds in a year, because they come to my talks, and who are just beside themselves, so to speak, as a consequence of experimenting with this diet.
Again, here he goes talking about weight. Yes, weight is important, but like I said just now, there is far more to health than just weight. You can be extraordinarily unhealthy and have a normal waistline. But these people that Jordan is speaking about, let's see where their health and his health are over the next 20 years, rather than jump into conclusions.
The food pyramid was actually produced not by scientists or by MDs, although there were some MDs who were consulting, who were mostly ignored, but by the Department of Agriculture. And it was a marketing scheme, essentially. And that the consequence of the marketing scheme was that people were enticed and convinced to rely primarily on carbohydrates for their nutritional necessities.
So Jordan has problems with fruits and vegetables, and therefore the whole food system is corrupt. The problem that Jordan is stupidly missing here is that while there is a food pyramid system in place, how many people actually come anywhere close to a healthy diet? For the vast majority of people in the Western world, they aren't even getting 5 portions of fruits and vegetables a day. So for Jordan to put his health issues and others' health issues at the doorstep of the food pyramid is bizarre. So I'm certainly not saying that food pyramids are not without their problems, but his whole argument here is very strange.
And perhaps carbohydrates at far too excess a level. Now, carbohydrates are transmuted into glucose during metabolism, and we eat way more carbohydrates than we need to produce the amount of glucose that we need. Now, people have been getting fatter in a catastrophic way for about 4 or 5 decades, and that's really in no small part since the introduction of the food pyramid. Now,
so the last time I checked, Jordan was a psychologist, yet he talks with such certainty over nutrition from his own anecdotal situation. People aren't eating whole food fruits and vegetables, they are loading up on processed refined junk foods. And I don't think you need to be an expert to understand this. So Jordan, show us your evidence that people who eat healthy diets consisting of whole foods are statistically likely to run into significant health problems.
I do understand that part of the reason the Department of Agriculture did this was because carbohydrates, and this was particularly true of corn syrup, do provide a very inexpensive source of calories. And if you're dirt poor and you don't have enough to eat, I mean, just getting enough calories, period, is of vital importance. Not everybody can afford steak, for example, or more expensive foods of that type, but virtually everyone, poor or not, in the West can afford basic carbohydrates.
Beans, pulses, fruits and vegetables are some of the cheapest foods around. So again, I'm not particularly sure what his point is here.
Having said that, I also have read, and I think it's valid, that there was early evidence that this heavy carbohydrate-loaded diet that was being prescribed was going to increase obesity and diabetes, which it's done at a level that makes the pandemic epidemic look like absolutely nothing. And this is still being pushed forward by people who are hypothetically on the nutritional front.
And again, the diets that are being pushed by the most sensible dietitians and nutritionists are about well-balanced diets. Most people, however, are not eating this way and are choosing processed refined foods. I am not sure that Jordan understands the premise that a whole food is something completely different to a processed refined food, and the impact that they can have on the body can be drastically different.
As you may or may not know, my daughter was very ill with a plethora of immunological problems, including very serious juvenile arthritis. And it just about killed her. It did destroy 2 of her joints, and she had another 38 that were affected. And so she was always in a lot of pain. And I looked into the role that diet played in arthritis through the scientific literature for a couple of years and found 2 things, and they were somewhat contradictory. And one was that there was no real evidence that any specific elements of diet had been linked to juvenile arthritis specifically, but
again, show us the relevant testing that was done on Michaela to look for underlying health problems for why she was reacting to certain foods in certain ways. Instead, what we have here is 2 + 2 is 64. They are trying to make something so black and white. They are simply saying she ate certain foods and she had certain health issues, therefore these foods must be the devil. Again, just to reiterate, the vast majority of the world's planet eat fruits and vegetables with no problem. So could it not even be a remote possibility that Michaela had an underlying problem and it's her body that's the issue?
And this was a major but. If people who are arthritic fasted completely, then their arthritic symptoms often disappeared. And so I thought that had something to do with the consequences of fasting. But then my daughter started to play, and my wife as well, very intensely with the diet. We went to a nutritionist who recommended an elimination diet at one point because we did notice that she would react to strawberries and oranges. And within a day, her thumbs would swell or her toes would swell. And so we knew there were some things she was eating. We had her tested for immunological reaction to food, but when we tested her, she showed a hyperreaction to virtually everything they tested her for.
So case in point here, they were testing when the food was already in the bloodstream. So clearly if there was an underlying problem, then testing the blood would show a problem. This is like not wearing protective shoes and wondering why your toes keep getting bashed up on a building site. Maybe if they took a step back and said, wait a minute, there is this really big thing called the digestive tract that breaks food down and puts it into the bloodstream. So what would happen if there was a problem with the way the gut was doing this? Is it not even remotely feasible that this is the problem and not the food itself? Or maybe that would be too easy.
And we concluded at that point, well, there's no damn way she could be reacting to everything she's eating. Well, she went on this elimination diet and showed a bit of reduction in symptom, but the elimination diet made no sense. Like there was no rhyme or reason to what you could eat and what you couldn't eat. And so she started to experiment with more restricted diets and eventually discovered that if she only ate beef, and it turns out for her it has to be beef that isn't aged, then all of her immunological symptoms disappeared.
Certainly sounds completely rational, that. Let's just remove everything and call foul play on fruits and vegetables.
And then my wife and I started playing with that diet. And so I've only been eating beef fundamentally, for almost 5 years now. And I eat a lot of meat and a lot of high fat meat. And so I'm never hungry. And I don't think that I'm calorie restricted at all because, I can eat a tomahawk steak sometimes in one sitting, which is about 35 ounces of meat.
So I eat, and many others eat, a lot of fruits and vegetables, and we only get hungry when it's time to eat. So again, what's your point here, Jordan?
I never get hungry, and I eat high-fat carnivore snacks too. The diet has actually been rejuvenating for my wife and I. Like its effect on muscle tone has to be seen to be believed, and that's true even though both of us are 60. Like my wife is in better shape from a musculature perspective now at 63 than she was when she was 40. And she was a very physically fit person who was exercising constantly and who was in pretty damn good shape.
So Jordan has said on numerous occasions that his and his family's diets were very poor indeed. But now in trying to justify his lion diet, they were suddenly always exercising and eating very well. This is like the time when he said the lion diet cured his depression, and then he ended up in rehab after becoming addicted to opiates.
And to see that reverse rather than just, stop deteriorating, I don't really know what to make of it. The reason that beef works and that other ruminant animals, bison, so forth, lamb, goat, is because they process what they eat through so many stomachs that by the time it is actually turned into meat, there's pretty much nothing else there. So it's a very purified form of nutritional very purified form of food.
Okay, but if you're having to eat such a purified form of anything, then it's your body that's the issue and not the food.
Now, like I said, that's anecdotal, and this is partly why I don't talk about it. But I can tell you, after you've talked to 1,000 people who tell you the same anecdote, you don't have an anecdote anymore, you have a hypothesis. And it's really quite something seeing these people who show me pictures of what they looked like a year ago. And, they were carrying around an extra person with them. And they're still shell-shocked by the transformation, because it's really something to lose, say, 150 pounds in a year.
He talks about hypothesis, yet he has removed all of the other elements of the hypothesis, and he's boiled it all down to the food is the issue, which, as a man of science that he claims to be, is hilarious.
The advantage, too, of the diet, the carnivore diet in particular, is because you can eat as much as you want. It's actually not a diet. The problem with diets is that they require privation and they require almost continual privation. And then they also tend to produce a yo-yo effect. And that's partly because if you get in a fight with your hypothalamus, which drives hunger, you're going to lose because it's there to make damn sure you don't starve. And the probability that you can override it for any length of time, well, it's very, very low.
It's a diet, hey? But I thought you and Michaela call the lion diet an elimination diet.
And that probably varies from person to person for all sorts of reasons. But you don't want to get in a scrap with your lower level motivational systems. Now, if I ever start to crave a banana split, for example, I can just eat another 5 or 6 ounces of steak and then I don't care. It's not like it wouldn't taste good, but it doesn't preoccupy me the way it would if I was hungry. I've really noticed this when I go into grocery stores, because if I go into a grocery store after having consumed enough meat, then the provision of this infinite display of delicious foods really doesn't affect me much. But boy, if I ever go into a grocery store when I'm hungry, that's quite the pain in the neck because everything's delightful and tempting, So the fact that you can eat enough or even as much as you want on a keto or carnivore diet does seem to distinguish it in some ways from the diets that depend more particularly on mere calorie restriction.
So he has to stuff himself full of meat so he doesn't crave nice foods. Sounds like a hoot, hey?
I noticed that as I got older, my ability to concentrate when I was reading was deteriorating. So when I was 25, 30, if I picked up a book and read it, I would shut everything else out, and I would concentrate on, focus on, attend to what I was reading, read every word and understand it with no problem. But that started to deteriorate as I got older, and I noticed that it took an increasing amount of effort to shut everything off, and that instead of reading as deeply as I was sort of glancing at the words. And when I started this carnivore diet, that reversed, and I actually think this is true. I think I can read faster and more efficiently than I could when I was in my 20s.
So earlier on, weight was the gold standard of health, and now reading words from a page is genius.
And I was pretty good at it when I was in my 20s. And so the other thing that I've noticed too is that I don't have periods of time. This was quite a problem for me, and it might have had something to do with my immunological problems, is that I would get hypoglycemic and lose the ability to concentrate and get, what do they call it, hangry, hungry and angry and irritable. And that would happen several times a day, probably because I was working too much. But in any case, that is gone completely.
Working way too much and hangry. Got it, Jordan. Any other little nuggets?
And I really don't miss it. I wake up in the morning with a stable mood, and my mood doesn't vary much throughout the day. I'm also much more stress tolerant and able to bounce back from stressors faster. And in terms of endurance, there were lots of times over the last 3 years when I was walking 9 to 12 miles a day on a carnivore diet. Now, I wasn't running, but my experience is that I'm stronger and I have more stamina than I did 10 years ago. And that's quite something, given that I'm now 62.
Again, he says all of these things, but his life shows opposites. He cured his depression on the lion diet, yet he got addicted to opiates. He is now better able to deal with stress, yet he is repeatedly breaking down on interviews. He says how much he loves the diet, but he repeatedly grumbles on how he's trapped in the diet. Actions speak louder than words, Jordan. Anyhow, that's the end of today's video, and if you enjoyed this video, then be sure to check out this one up here because I'm sure you'll find it equally interesting. And the only other thing that's left for me to say is to remember to look after your body because it's the only place you have to live. And I'll see you next time.